Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. These are just making clear our sin problem, that it's not just like, well, you know, a lot of people think, well, I'm bad, but I'm not Adolf Hitler bad. Well, you know, if you're comparing yourself to other people, yeah, that's true. You might not be that bad. But if the standard is perfection in God, you're pretty bad off, right? And that's really the message of the gospel here. James tells us here, for whoever slips on the whole law, that stumbles at one point, he's guilty of them all. So if you stumble at one point, it's as if you've performed them all. And then Romans 3:10 tells us what? As is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No, not one. Of course, we know sin through the law given to us in the Ten Commandments and Deuteronomy and Exodus, and applied in our hearts and our lives in various ways. And then in Romans 3:19 through 20, what do we get from the law? The law is necessary. We got to have the law when we explain the gospel, because look what this passage says. Notice the underlined parts. Every mouth will be stopped. There's no excuses. The law exposes sin. It holds accountable to God, who is creator and holy. And we are without excuse before him. Which brings us to the third part here. We have this fractured relationship. Jesus is the answer. He's the one that can fix this, right? Look at Romans 5:8. But God showed his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. What did Jesus say in John 14:6? What rolls off of his lips? He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father, what, church, except through me. John 1:14, the Word became flesh, dwelt among us. I don't know how many of you in here are Star Wars fans. Are any of you Star Wars fans? Maybe one or two. All right. If George Lucas wanted to meet Luke Skywalker, how would he do that? Now, he could meet Mark Hamill, the actor, but if George Lucas wanted to enter the world that he created with his mind, he would have to write himself into the movies. That's the only way it could be done. In a similar fashion here, God had to engage in inner creation as Jesus Christ, live a perfect life, die a perfect death, and then rise from the dead. Romans 6:9 and 10 tell us we know that Christ was raised from the dead. He cannot die again. Death no longer has mastery over him. And then the last part, this is the gift. This is the conciseness of it. If you have a gift here for you, if I have a gift prepared for you tonight, you still have to reach your hands out and take it. You have to open the package and receive it. How do you do that? Well, Romans 10:9 tells us what? If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Romans 10:10, for with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. And then finally there, everyone who believes in him will not be put to death. Romans 10:11. This is not just the belief part of it. That word kind of gets abused in our language. It's not just about acknowledging a good man that did good things and has no bearing on my life day to day, but it is believing Jesus Christ is Lord, that he is God, that his sacrifice is sufficient for the payment of all my sin, and confessing and being in agreement with God on step 2, that yes, I am a sinner. Yes, my relationship is broken. Yes, I need help. And then finally, on the back, there's a few instructions on what to do if you've trusted Christ. Be baptized, share the good news, make disciples, become part of a local church. And so there it is. Is this tool helpful? So if you're ever asked to, do that, there are some mistakes in there. There are 3 mistakes that I know of in the one in your hand. If you find more mistakes, please circle them, correct it, highlight it, turn it back into me. I promise you I'll get you a brand new one, or as many more as you want. And I designed this week to be a help to the church for this weekend's outreach and beyond that. Okay? That's great. Well, yeah, I would prefer, you could leave these around, but I would prefer that you actually give a presentation, like that you speak to somebody and use this as a tool to do so. So anyhow, but yeah, just look that over for me. I'm going to slip one back here to a future English major, make sure that she looks it over. That's a proof there. You tell me if any mistakes are, okay? All right, we're in another minor prophet tonight. We're going to be in the Book of Micah. And I'm going to give you an introduction of it tonight, just so we'll know. I don't think we're going to get very far in the book itself, so just kind of you're aware of who he is and where he is heading in his ministry and his work. The minor prophets, unfortunately, are not frequently addressed or preached on in Sunday mornings, and they are well worth our time. The thing about minor prophets is they are only minor because they are shorter than the other longer ones, like Daniel and Isaiah and some of these other ones. So we want to be sure that we give this adequate weight. The words that are in there are the same weight as what we would find in Jeremiah or Isaiah or any of the other major prophets. But in some ways, since these prophets don't have as much revelation recorded, they're sharper. You understand what I'm telling you? Like the word kind of gets in there, has to get in there faster. And so as we think about this, we need to kind of keep that in mind. Let's talk about this book and its message and what's going on culturally at the time. We are at this point in Israel's history. Israel and Judah have rejected the king's covenant that we read about in Deuteronomy, God's covenant that he made with them, and they have embraced idolatry and are placing their faith in kind of copying the other pagan nations that are around them. The kingdom has already split, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. We all are familiar with that story of how Solomon, whenever he was about to die, his son took over, and his son, instead of loving the northern kingdom, they had a meeting. And do you remember how the meeting ended? To your tents, O Israel, and Israel left. Israel, whenever Micah is done preaching, will face utter collapse. Israel will be overrun shortly after these prophecies are given, and they will never recover. Judah will somewhat stay intact, but Israel, as it is known in the Old Testament, the northern kingdoms, after Micah's preaching and after they're invaded this last time, they don't bounce back. A couple of things we know about this book as we read through it here. We're at about 751 BC, prior to Christ. One of the reasons that I selected Micah right here in this run, if you'll notice, we're getting closer to the most wonderful time of the year, which is Christmas, right? And Micah kind of prepares us for Jesus in a lot of ways. And so as we're working through this, Jesus helps us make sense of a lot of the prophecies that Micah has. In 586, Jerusalem will eventually fall to the Babylonians. We've kind of talked about some of that with previous minor prophet studies. And this book, we're going to see, kind of breaks into three sort of sections. Verses 1, or chapter 1 through 2 is the first section. Chapters 3 through 5, second, and 6 and 7, the third sort of block of material that he prophesies in and with. What we're seeing happening in Israel and in Judah is there is deep-seated idolatry. This is actually a time in the nation's history when economically both Israel and Judah are doing well. If you look at the map of the time whenever Micah is prophesying, you will actually see that their kingdom boundaries were as almost expanded out as much as under King David and King Solomon. And during that time was Israel's heyday. That was the time of prosperity, no war. It was a good time. And on top of that, those expanded boundaries almost as big as David and Solomon's of the day. Israel's economy was doing good in the north, and Judah's economy in the south was doing good as well. And on top of this good economic conditions and environment, you had a lot of religion sort of sprinkled in the culture. But it wasn't always Yahweh, God-fearing religion that's sprinkled in there. What we'll see in these prophecies is it was actually quite a bit of idolatry sprinkled in with the one true and living God. Another issue that we see is a lack of reverence for the sovereignty of God by the people of Judah. They just don't have this understanding. They would regularly go to the temple and worship, but then they would leave and live not really even how they saw fit. They were actually more copying their pagan neighbors. So if you were to, it's kind of like, we're going to go to the temple, we will offer our sacrifices and try to worship Yahweh in the temple, we'll put our money in the coffers and the plate. We're going to go home and we're going to put a shrine to Asherah, one of the Canaanite gods, and in the grape garden there. We're going to put another one out in the field to the god of the harvest, the Canaan god of harvest. And we're going to put another one over here in another field for the god of the sun. We need a lot of sun on these crops, so we're going to do a shrine over here to the pagan god of the sun. And so, yes, they were going to the temple, but there was a problem with synchronism, right? There was a problem of worshiping Canaanite deities at home. And so you can imagine how God feels about this, right? They're kind of limiting God to the temple and going home and have all these bathtub shrines. That's just how I imagine them in my head. I don't think they were literally bathtub shrines, but there were a lot of them when I lived in Indiana. They would have these, like, it was a very Catholic thing to do. They had statues, and they had, these little bath wash tub things turned up sideways in their yard, little shrines. And so I just always in my mind envision that when I read about these different things. What are some of the themes that run through the book of Micah? Well, one of the major themes we're going to see is that God is sovereign over all the nations. God is going to make that very clear. He will what He will will. That's one of the major things going to emerge from this book. And He will be faithful to His covenant. There is, if you look back and you read about the covenant that was established in Deuteronomy chapter 38, their life in the land was dependent upon God's worship. God had made it very clear if they will worship Him, that He would make sure they were well taken care of. And if they did not worship Him, there were consequences. We don't really do covenants in our culture now, right? We do contracts, right? Contracts are binding agreements, usually involving money. We do have a covenant that we make, right? That's pretty regular in our culture. Can anybody guess what that covenant is that we regularly see in our culture now? Marriage. It's a marriage covenant, right? That's the closest thing that we have to that. And, I've seen people do discipleship, and they'll talk about, discipleship contracts, and it always makes me cringe a little bit. I was like, can't we just use biblical language and make it a covenant, like in the Old Testament? Very, a set of detailed instructions. Not only lays out what is owed financially from one party of another, but a covenant is more expansive. A covenant is about relationships, right? It's not just about money. That's one of the things I don't like about a contract. Usually contracts, generally speaking, are primarily centered on money and money only. But there are more facets to a covenant than just that, right? There are more consequences that are grave and dire than just that as well. So we'll see a theme emerge that God is faithful to His covenant, right? When Jesus came to earth, what did He tell us? I came to give you a new what? A new covenant, right? So one of the applications that we're going to see as New Testament believers is if God was faithful to the Old Testament people as they were engaged in gross idol worship at home, and yes, there was discipline and there was punishment, but just like we saw in Habakkuk, like what was it, last week we were in Habakkuk, there was mercy in the midst of all that was happening to them. There was still mercy extended to them. How much more now in the new covenant is God's going to be faithful to His covenant? Faithfulness and blessing, we're going to see that. We're also going to see God will execute judgment. He will execute judgment on the people. All right, let's talk a little bit more about Isaiah or Micah's contemporaries. Can you name anyone who would have been alive about the same time Micah was? Does anybody know? It's kind of fun. Isaiah was alive at the same time. Yes, so he would have been a contemporary of Micah's. There's one more prophet in the Old Testament that would have been alive at the same time. He liked trimming trees. He was an old country boy. Famous Amos, right? Amos in the Old Testament. So he had Amos, Isaiah, and Micah, all preaching. Of course, I think Amos's audience was primarily the northern kingdom at the time. I think that's where he was sent to go. And Micah prophesying in the southern kingdom. This is before the north has fallen, before that's happened. Jerusalem is going to eventually fall in 586. And if we open this book and we look at it, one of the things that's interesting to me about Micah is he just jumps right into it. Would somebody care to read the first couple of verses tonight for us? Can I get a volunteer to read the first 2 verses of Micah? We'll just see what I'm talking about here. Is anybody there already? Thank you. All right, so, man, there is, if you'll notice here on the front of this book, there is no hook, right? There's nothing like to draw you in and hook you in. There is no soft sell. Now, people, listen, I've got the deal of the century for you. There's nothing like that. There's no wit on the front of the book. He just dives directly in to, this is what God has said. I mean, it's just straight into it. There had been a bit of a revival, at the time going into this, and with King Hezekiah. Judah had experienced, somewhat of a spiritual revival before all this, but, revivals don't tend to last forever, do they? Revivals tend to come and go. And what we're seeing here as we look at this is rebellion at all levels. And I want to say something about rebellion. Few things are as destructive in life than rebellion. We can all identify with that statement because we've all been rebellious. Rebellion appears in our lives like an uninvited guest, right? But it soon takes up residency in our hearts and it expands out into other areas. For many of us, it begins as teens or even children, small children. And it's funny to me, all parents can attest to this, you don't really have to teach your children how to rebel. They come out knowing rebellion right away, don't they? You didn't have to sit down with your child and give them a lecture on how to lie, how to break stuff, or how to cover stuff up. They just know how to do it. You know what I mean? It is innate in their nature. And when we rebel, what are we rebelling against? Usually it's authority of some kind. Rebellion against our parents, teachers, and coaches. And what happens when that rebellion is left unchecked? Is it better for a child for rebellion like that to remain unchecked in their life? It grows. And what happens? It spills over to their employers whenever they become adults. They don't respect law enforcement. And they certainly will not respect the government, nor the church, nor the Bible, nor their pastors. It will spill into all areas of life. Ultimately, though, rebellion is always against who? It's really against God, isn't it? Because God institutes all forms of authority. Isn't that the Bible tells us in Romans? It tells us that He has given the state the sword. All authority has been given by Him. And here's what we see. Micah 1:1, we read these words. The word of the Lord came to Micah. And he sees these things. These verses provide us with some important information. The small town that he's from here. He names this small town that he's from in the region of Judah. He is the southern contemporary of Amos. And Amos was a country boy as well. Micah and Amos are living proof that God calls people to serve Him from the most unlikely of backgrounds that there can be in backwoods areas. He always cares more. Here's one of the principles we see just in this very opening line. God cares more about our hearts than our heritage, doesn't He? He cares more about our hearts than our heritage. Despite his southern roots, though, Micah probably spent much of his time in sprawling metropolitan-type areas like Jerusalem. Micah's name literally means who is Yahweh? Who is God? Who is Yahweh? And his prophecies will answer that question as we move through it. The verses here reveal Micah served God as a prophet during the reign of 3 kings in Judah. 3 kings. Remember what I told you about kings in the north and the south, right? If you don't know if they're good or bad, what's the best answer to give? They're usually bad, right? 9 times out of 10, they're bad. And so we see that he served under 3 Judean kings. Jotham was king on the throne in Judah when Micah began his ministry, reigning. He reigned in Judah from 749 to 733. Jotham was a king who feared God, like his father Uzziah before him. So he was one of the exceptions. He didn't succumb to the pride that destroyed his father. Does anyone remember what happened to Uzziah? Who remembers real quick? Leprosy, yeah. Do we want to read about it? Let's turn over to it. Somebody turn to 2 Chronicles 26, 16 through 23. And we'll look at this real quick. It's not a very long read. 2 Chronicles 26, 16 through 23. Do you have it, Sam? Oh, do you have 2 Chronicles? I thought you were flipping over there. Maybe you don't. Okay. Do you have it over here? Have you got it, Chris? That's good. So, what was the sin there that his grandfather was guilty of? He was a king, but he took a job that was specifically designated for the priest, and he did that job. He thought he could just do kind of whatever he wanted in the temple and worship. There's a principle for worship there, right? What is that principle? There are certain regulatory practices for worship of the one true and living God, which must be adhered to by God's people of all generations, right? Some of those things that we would say now is that the services should be biblically centered. They should be centered on the Scripture. They should be centered on the gospel. That should never be deviated from. The songs that are sung there should also reinforce the word that is being preached and practiced there. So, now, despite Jotham's personal obedience to God, Israel plunged into further sinful practice of idolatry while he was king. And then he had a son. And this son, you might know. His name is Ahaz. Does anybody remember King Ahaz? Can I give you what R.G. Lee... Have I shared with you what R.G. Lee said about King... Who knows who R.G. Lee is? Some of y'all know, right? He was one of the greatest preachers of a few years ago. Ahaz, in his great sermon, I think it's Payday Someday, he would say about King Ahaz, "Behold, the most vile toad who ever squatted on the throne of Judah," right? He just was an awful, awful person, right? Ahaz was married to who? Remember? To Jezebel, right? And the second king under here that he served, he reigned from 733 to 713. He was wicked. He was idolatrous. He erected idols all over Judah for the people to worship. He offered his sons as burnt sacrifices to pagan gods. Ahaz did this. And even closed the temple of Yahweh. His actions modeled idolatry for the people and continued to follow their king on this disobedient path. And consequently, God used the Syrians, the northern tribe of Israel, and the Assyrians to humble him and judge the nation. And you can read about that in 2 Chronicles 28. Hezekiah is the son of Ahaz. What do you think? Good king or bad king? Good king. So we went good, bad, good. Third king under Micah, reigned from 713 to 684. Amazingly, Hezekiah, despite being the son of Ahaz, a wicked, wicked, vile man, rejected the idolatry of his father and embraced the faith of his grandfather that was before him. In the first year as king, he reopened the temple. So that's a good start, right? Reestablished the worship of Yahweh, the one true and living God, and challenged the people to tear down the places of idols in Judah, which they did. And you can read about that in 2 Chronicles 29 through 31:21. So if you want to read some of that background, you're welcome to it. Hezekiah was far from perfect. He loved God and he sought to obey him, and God blessed him for it. And you can read about the blessings God gave him in 2 Chronicles 31:20-21. And then finally we see in this verse, Micah prophesied both to the southern kingdom in Judah, whose capital is in Jerusalem, and to the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital is in Samaria. And as we look at the range of dates, one date particularly leaks through, and that's 722 BC. And as you remember, this is when the northern kingdom of Israel was defeated by the nation of Assyria. And the collapse of the northern kingdom here was swift and it was permanent. It would never be reestablished. And Micah was still serving God as prophet when that event occurred. And as a result, we see him addressing both Israel and Judah as he writes the books. Isaiah, who is a contemporary of his, how many chapters are in the book of Isaiah, by the way? Do you know off the top of your head? He wrote 66, right? 66 chapters. There's a lot of Isaiah. In Micah's book, we only got 7. And that seems strange when we consider all the events that happened to Micah as he served the Lord for 30 years. And I don't think this implies that the messages are here unimportant or less weight than Isaiah's messages, but rather it designates here the fact that the minor prophets are shorter and, like I said, have to cut kind of quicker with their shorter words. You know, I have a friend and we talk often about sermon length, and I think you guys have been with me long enough to know I'm a believer in shorter sermons. I aim for about 25 minutes or so, 25 minutes. I'm trying to quit before you do, right? That's the goal, on Sunday morning. And I got a friend, he preaches 45 minutes to an hour on Sunday morning. And I said, brother, I don't know, man. I said, it is more challenging to put together a shorter sermon than a longer sermon. You know why? Because you got to make every word count in a shorter sermon. You got to make your transitions and everything count more. And so he's like, well, I can see that. I was like, well, like I said, just try to quit before you people do. That's what you want to do. You want to walk away saying, then I wish I'd heard more, instead of walking away saying, man, he went way too long, right? I have never been criticized for a short message, but I have had some feedback on some longer ones, right? So, anyhow. All right, now the message here. We talked about sort of the circumstance. Any questions or comments on the circumstances that this prophet finds himself in? The cultural, political kind of landscape that he finds himself serving in? A good stretch of his ministry is pretty rough. I mean, any ministry under King Ahaz is going to be rough, right? And so we see him ministering at the same time that's going on. All right, now we turn our attention to chapter 1, seeing verses 2 through 4. Micah wastes no time. Somebody read verses 3 and 4 for us here in Micah chapter 1. All right, good. So we heard just a minute ago, Jerry read, God is a witness against what? Their sin. He sees the empty worship, they're coming in and they're, first thing we see right out of the bed here, he's saying, look, I see this all. I see all this sin. I see all this idolatry. I see how you treat the temple. I see how you treat worship with me. His throne room in heaven comes down to earth, and when he gets here, it's not pretty. Micah here is using apocalyptic type language in these verses. By definition, this type of language is reserved only for the most devastating of events that could happen. The fall of Israel in 722 being one of those, and the subsequent fall of Judah in 586. So it's coming. They're going to meet that criteria. Here Micah provided the rationale for the impending judgment that God was going to cast on them. Let's look at did you read verses 2 and through 4? All right, let's read verse 5 now. Somebody read verse 5 for us, nice and loud. All right. God's judgment was coming as a result of the sins of Jacob. Does anybody remember what the sins of Jacob were? That's going back a while, right? 1 Kings 11 teaches us that Solomon turned away from God in his old age, right, to worship idols. The Bible tells us and records that for us. Here's an example. You know, I'm coming to conclude this about the figures in the Old Testament and then figures in church history and preachers of old. Starting good is great, right? How you start's really important, but it's not nearly as important as how you finish, right? How you finish says a whole lot more about who you are and your character than how you start, right? I've seen many young men enter a pulpit, fire, brimstone, ready to go, in love with many fiery words, only to be devastated with character flaws and out of the ministry in a short amount of time. They don't finish well. And unfortunately for Solomon, this was true. Solomon started excellent. I don't really know of any Old Testament figure that had a better start than Solomon. Do you? I mean, you know, God comes to him and says, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And you could, you know, you think about it, if God came to your house tonight and said, I'll give you whatever you want, you just name it, what would you say, right? And he asked for something that was the perfect answer, and that was wisdom. And God blessed him abundantly through that. But consequently, he turned his heart in idol worship. What was it that turned his heart, by the way? What's that? Wives? Yeah, he got entangled in relationships that drug him under, right? I had a dream the other night about a book. Maybe it's a book I need to write. It was Relational Pull of Idolatry. I even saw the cover of it. It was a boat being pulled underwater, right? It reminded me of Solomon just being pulled under by these pagan wives that he took as he was ruling. This is one of the reasons why I always warn young people, do not marry unbelievers. Do not do it, right? They lack capacities for love, for wisdom, and for other things that we have, and they will, I know it's kind of fun to think maybe I could help turn them to the Lord. More than likely, they will turn you away from God. More than likely. Solomon is an example of that. While God spared Solomon from judgment for David's sake, Solomon's sons were not so fortunate. Rehoboam became king after him, continued in Solomon's ways. He was a wicked king who led the people into idol worship, and because he was responsible for the division of Solomon's realm into two pieces, he was indirectly responsible for all of the sin that occurred in the northern kingdom under King Jeroboam. The roots of idolatry have grown into full-blown effect by the time of Mica. It is, it's never thought of the generational effect that sin will have, but it has generational effects. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not forgiven for sin. It doesn't mean you're not made a new creation whenever Christ saves you, but the consequences of sin carry on long after the sin is over, right? Let me see if I can illustrate this real quick for you. If we have a cousin who's far from the Lord, and he decides he's going to get let's say he's in college, and he decides he's going to go out and get a credit card, and he goes crazy buying all kinds of booze for a party, gets drunk, and sleeps with a woman he doesn't even know, gets her pregnant, and at the end of the night, the next morning, an old message from Billy Graham comes on, and he prays and accepts Christ that morning. Well, his sin is forgiven, and he's a new creation in Christ, but he still owes the credit card company for every piece of alcohol that he bought that night, every little piece, and now he has the consequences of a child out of wedlock that he's going to be hitched to for years to come. Just because you've been forgiven a sin does not mean you're completely eradicated from the consequences of that sin. Does that make sense tonight? You understand that? As believers, we live with those consequences all the time of our previous family members and of our own, okay? And so that's what we're seeing happening here, and it's like the more leadership you have, like a king or a priest or a high priest, the more ripples in the water is created when sin hits the life of somebody like that. So the roots of idolatry here, they've grown into full bloom. Second thing we see here, God's judgment was coming because of the sins of Israel. Israel had been created as a result of Rehoboam's sinful pride, right? If you'll remember back, I'm not going to make you flip there, but Israel told them, they said, if you'll just love us and be kind to us and not put a heavy yoke on us like your father Solomon did, not tax us real heavy. We will love you and follow you forever, right? Do you remember when they said that? They told him that if you will just love us and just, quit taxing us to death, we'll follow you. And what was Rehoboam's response, right? He could have had a great kingdom there. He could have kept it together. And he could, I'm sure he had some more seasoned advisors saying, listen to Israel and their leaders. You can do this. We can work through this. And instead, he takes the advice of his buddies. Well, if you thought my dad was bad, wait till you get a load of me, right? That's a TTV, Travis Tyler version. He's like, I'm going to tax you double, triple. It's going to be heavy. And that's when they said, okay, do your 10 so Israel, and they were done, right? Israel had been created because of the consequences of his pride. He wanted to look big, bad, and tough, and had something to prove. Jeroboam went so far as to create a counterfeit system of worship. And in the north, they elected their own leader there, and he made a counterfeit system of worship. And they moved, they made worships of 2 golden calves located in Dan and Bethel, where they claimed to worship Yahweh there. They didn't want to go down to Judah no more. They broke off from there. They didn't need all that no more. They wanted their own thing. They wanted their own capital of worship, and that was when it was established. And as a result, the people of Israel maintained a consistent practice of an idolatry to where we see Micah now, both Judah and Israel. And this is the language of the Old Testament, that they prostituted themselves, spiritually prostituted themselves to foreign gods in direct obedience to God's revealed truth through the law. All right. Let's read verses 6 and 7, and we'll probably stop there tonight because I've kind of explained those. Somebody read those last 2, and then we'll be done for the night. All right, thank you. God is not pleased with this spiritual prostitution that he is seeing. He is not pleased with being treated as one who is just contained in the temple and that's it, and people living not even how they want, but just mimicking and copying the world that surrounds them. There is a lot of principles we're going to pull from this, but I think tonight one of the things we need to walk away from is this. You can't show dead people what life is if you're playing dead, right? In other words, you can't go on living and influenced like by pagans and by those who are dead spiritually and think that they see something that they need to be conformed to or transformed by. We have to have lives that are markedly different than those that are around us. I was listening to a sermon today from Alistair Begg, who personally encourages my soul on so many levels, and I like his accent, and that helps too. He's from across the pond in Scotland. And he was sharing about a lot of churches that are just dead now. They have let so much of the world in that they are no longer of any use. And he talked about one of the most liberal denominations in the country. I think it's United Church of Christ. No, I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, their headquarters is in Cleveland, Ohio. And he said that a friend of his was on an elevator with 2 guys. They recently had a campaign was, don't put a period where God puts a comma, trying to say that God still speaks above and beyond, and he's telling them that it's okay to violate what's previously been handed down and all these different things. That's what's in that campaign there. And he was talking to these two men that were married to each other. They were representatives of this church, and he was asking them, well, what do you do with the passage where Jesus says, a man shall leave his mother and father and cling to his what? To his wife. What do you do with that passage? And they looked at him and they just said, quite frankly, we don't believe the Bible. That's what they just turned and told us, that we just don't believe it. And so, that at least he was honest and truthful that they don't believe it. There's a call here and a lesson here that we must learn. The mistakes that were made here and the idol worship and practices that were there. Sure, we don't necessarily have wash tub idols in our yards, but we've got things that we fight against, right? You know, when conflicts arise in the church, do we fight like the pagans that are around us and throw lawsuits at one another and get angry and you know, passive-aggressively go after one another? Do we worship money? Are we most concerned about money as a people, as individuals, and as a church? Do we see the true value of the church is not in dollars, but in souls that Jesus loved and died for? You know, these are things we can get caught up in as idols, that while we don't have shrines to them, it's very clear in many churches that there are shrines to them in the hearts of the people. So anyway, any questions or comments on Micah? Fun opening tonight. Lots of judgment and lots of... but good reminders here. Okay, let's turn our attention to prayer at this time then. You have your prayer sheets here. Any additions or corrections here? Okay. Good. Any others? No, I think if she did, it's news to me. They had a thing that said she was cancer-free in the yard this week. Walker Robinson's wife? No, Jerry. That's Jerry's sister-in-law. He says no. She's cancer-free, right? And like the yard said? Okay. Yeah. I mean, that for a believer, that is a way to be cancer-free, but I think it's actually, she's just physically cancer-free. So, yeah. I don't think they would put balloons and stuff out there like that and put cancer-free if she died. That'd be pretty morbid, you know what I mean, to do something like that. So, all right. All right. Any others? Vicky Ray's brother passed this morning. Just found out right before service here. All right. Okay, well, let's turn to the Lord in prayer. And can I get somebody to open us tonight? Who will volunteer to open us? And we'll just do like popcorn prayer where you can pray if you feel led or sit silently if you don't. Somebody like to open us tonight? Sam, would you open us? Is that okay? And then who will close us tonight? Somebody close us tonight? Miriam, will you close us tonight? Is that all right? Just give people time to pray. It'll be good. All right, we'll go ahead and turn to the Lord in prayer now.